Good morning, everyone. My name is Stacy Frederick. I'm the coordinator for the California Fire Science Consortium based at UC Berkeley. Today we're going to be talking with Kristen Shive. She graduated in 2017 with her PhD in ecosystem science from UC Berkeley and also holds a master in forestry from Northern Arizona University. Her research is broadly focused on applied research questions that can support forest and fire management decision-making. And after a long career with the National Park Service, she has recently accepted a job as the senior scientist with Save the Redwoods Lake. All right, Kristen, it's all you.
Great. Thank you so much, Stacy. I'm excited to be here and present some of the data from a project that was part of my dissertation, and the title of this talk is High Severity Reburns in Sierra Mixed Conifer. And I'm just going to go ahead and jump in. My co-authors I'll mention Hugh Safford at UC Davis, and also the Forest Service Pacific Southwest region, as well as Scott Stevens and Kevin O'Hara at UC Berkeley. So probably folks who are watching this webinar are not going to be surprised or already know that, in the Sierra Nevada mixed conifer, we've had a real change in fire regimes. Historically, we think fires were pretty frequent, of generally low to moderate severity, a lot of ground fire with occasional group torching, and smaller patches of high severity. And of course, fire suppression has dramatically increased fuel loads over 100 years of excluding fire. And that in turn has increased the incidence and patch size of high severity fire. One of the big things that this has done in turn is increase the distance to conifer seed sources after the fire. And so there's a lot of concern about the potential for shifts away from forest to shrub-dominated landscapes, primarily due to this seed limitation. And what you see here in this picture is a very large patch of high severity from the 2014 King Fire on the El Dorado National Forest. And so generally what we think sort of happens is that you have this fire suppressed forest, you get a severe fire, and then you get this regenerating montane chaparral in the system. Occasionally you get more grassy dominated areas, but it's pretty standard for these areas in the Sierra Nevada to regenerate as montane chaparral. And that, of course, also can limit forest regeneration, as the shrubs really heavily compete for moisture and light with regenerating conifer seedlings. And so, as I mentioned, folks have been getting really concerned about the potential for this to lead to a type conversion, where we get persistent montane chaparral in the landscape and we're not getting forest back. But seed limitation isn't really the only part of the story. When we talk in ecology about alternative stable states, what we're really talking about is an alternative state that's maintained by a positive feedback. And positive feedbacks can be defined as a process in which biotic factors interact with disturbance to reinforce a community state. And so the key here is that it's not just the seed limitation, which through time, eventually, as trees seed in from the edge, mature, produce more seed, and seed in from that edge, eventually there's a wave-like front of regeneration that could occur across these large patches of high severity. But for a real type conversion to occur, you may need sort of this other mechanism where there's something reinforcing that shrub-dominated state and interrupting that long march of regeneration. And one of the ways that that could happen in these systems would be a second severe fire before the area has time to regenerate into a mature forest. And so to sort of look at these questions, or to look at this issue, we had two primary research questions. And the first was, is there evidence that montane chaparral has a positive feedback with severe fire? And to assess that positive feedback, we looked at first reburn severity. So are these areas that are shrub dominated tending to burn severely when they do reburn? And then also dominance by regeneration strategy. And basically what we're getting at here is that if the montane chaparral vegetation, these shrubs, they can sprout, and they also have fire-cued seed germination. In contrast, the conifers are what we call obligate seeders. And so when you have severe fire, the conifers aren't going to respond as well because they will always need to seed in, whereas the shrubs on site are really well poised to respond really positively to severe fire. So if in fact that we're getting that positive feedback of high severity, what you would see in the feedback loop is that this dense montane chaparral is promoting high severity fire, which in turn promotes that fire cue germination and sprouting of shrubs or the sprouting of oak species, and giving those a leg up to those obligate seeding conifers. Our second research question is okay, so if there is a real shift going on after you get a second severe fire before reforestation occurs, is there evidence that the second severe fire results in a distinct state? And we had some hypotheses of what that might look like. And first, we thought that in repeated high severity fire areas, we might see more homogeneous plant communities due to basically an increasingly restrictive environmental filter. And what that might look like is lower species richness, also lower beta diversity in repeated high severity areas. And I'll talk a lot about once burned at high severity and repeated high severity areas. And the repeated are HH and the once burned are UH. And you'll see that a lot throughout this talk. And that lower beta diversity in that repeated high severity areas, that's important, that's a measure that looks just not at the total species richness found in repeated high severity areas, but how it varies between all of our plots. Are they all more similar to each other than they would be in the once burned at high severity areas? We also hypothesized we might see lower, oh, apologies, that's a typo. See higher non-native richness or cover in repeated high severity areas just because of that additional disturbance. And we know that non-native species tend to like disturbance. Some of our other hypotheses included higher richness of south temperate versus north temperate species. And what we mean by that is the evolutionary history of certain species. Are they generally adapted to more south temperate climates or north temperate climates? And is that richness shifting so that we're seeing a shift towards species that are better adapted to more of a montane chaparral vegetation type in terms of the understory. We also hypothesize there might be higher plant cover in repeated high severity areas, and that's just because the shrubs that were there could get a faster start because they were already dominating the site in terms of sprouting immediately after the fire. And then we also just suspected there could be overall differences in plant community composition and abundance. So to look at this, we had two sites that we used. There are two high severity reburns, we're calling them, that we measured in 2016. And the first is the Ackerson fire that's up here outlined in the dark black that reburned in 2013 by the Rim fire. And we did our measurements 3 years post-fire. And then there's the 1990 A-Rock fire here in this dashed line that reburned in 2009's Big Meadow fire. We measured that 7 years post-fire. We intentionally restricted our sampling to Yosemite National Park in order to control for management history, since on the Forest Service side of the fence, there was a lot of salvage logging and other operations in between the two fires that could confound our results. And so in both reburns, we sampled past high severity areas, as I mentioned, these past high severity areas that reburned in the most recent fire severely. And so what you see here are overlain burn severity maps where red is the high severity. And the darker colors, that in this case is the Ackerson fire, that was that dark red patch. And when it reburned in the Rim fire, it again reburned at high severity. We also looked at areas that were once burned at high severity. So these are new patches of high severity in the most recent fire. And in both cases, then we're sampling since the same time since fire after the last fire. And this is just some visuals of how these areas differ and what they look like. You can see a huge difference in the amount of standing dead trees, as well as some differences in the understory. In total, we sampled 111 plots across both the unburned high and repeated high severity areas. We sampled species richness, plant cover, fuels, shrub biomass, which we didn't sample the shrub biomass, but we used some allometric equations to estimate it. And then we also sampled conifer regeneration. For statistics, I'm not going to go in depth into these, but you can see them here if you're curious, and they're going to be described more in the paper we have that we're hoping to get out very soon. And this just describes how we measured everything. I think one of the important things to note here, though, is for all of them, we did include some of those basic drivers of vegetation response that we expect could be contributing to differences or confounding differences, like elevation, aspect, slope, etc. Okay, so I'm just going to jump into our results. And so with that first question where we were looking at positive feedbacks in terms of reburn severity, what you see here is on the x-axis, we have the prior fire severity from no fire history at all, undetected change. And so that's an area within the fire perimeter that the satellites didn't really pick up a change. And that means that either it's an unburned island or it burns so lightly or so low that the satellites couldn't pick it up under tree canopy. Low, moderate, and high severity, with high severity being over 90% tree mortality. On the y-axis, we have burn severity, and that's using the relativized difference normalized burn ratio using the initial assessment. And the lines that are going across the graph, the orange, red, and green, those are the thresholds that are standardly used to demarcate the different severity classes. In terms of the box plots, I'm going to go through these because we're going to look at a lot of these box plots. The line in the middle of the box is the median. The box represents the first and third quartile, and then out to the dots you get the outliers, outlying values. In these, the gray boxes are Big Meadow fire, and the white boxes are the rim fire, where those reburned each their own individual fires. And so what you can see here is that pretty clearly the areas that burned at high severity had really the greatest chance of reburning at high severity, and that's a subsequent fire. We also looked at this in terms of vegetation type to see what exactly was driving it. And all the places where we did see areas reburn at high severity, it's primarily in that montane chaparral, which is generally what's regenerating in those areas, a little bit in oak woodland on the Big Meadow fire, which is mixed with the montane chaparral, and then some meadows on the rim fire. And meadow, it also includes sort of the drier grassy areas that have regenerated after the Ackerson fire there. So we did see that, yes, there seems to be a positive feedback where high severity begets high severity. In terms of domination or dominance by regeneration strategy, we looked, since we only have the seeding conifers and we didn't really have any shrub species that were primarily just cedars, we basically measured, got our biomass estimates from individuals shrub individuals that we knew had seeded or sprouted. And we got there by my poor crew having to dig around under transects and to figure out, and under lots of dense shrubs to try and figure out whether the individuals intercepted had actually sprouted or seeded. And what you can see is that in general, the sprouted individuals had more biomass, but that shoots up and is much, much higher in that repeated high severity area. And I think that's because in those areas, you know, the shrubs had time to really grow pretty good, pretty good storage in their roots, so that they're really poised to sprout after that second fire. And there's a pretty strong reduction in the number that's seeded. And this, I think, is actually probably the most important and most interesting result that we found, which is trying to understand how these obligate seeding conifers are responding differently in these areas with different fire history of once versus twice burned at high severity. Excuse me. And what you can see is that the gray dots are the repeated high severity, and all the numbers are fairly low. They're pretty close to zero or really, really low densities of conifer seedlings, whereas the unburned high are much, much higher. The other thing you'll notice, and in this case, I should have mentioned, so the y-axis is conifer seedlings per hectare. On the x-axis, I've shown these distributed as distance from lesser burned edge. And the reason is I want to be really transparent and show that, yes, the areas that burn at high severity repeatedly, those areas, we tended to have some bigger patch sizes. So you can see that over 300 meters from a lesser burned edge, and we say lesser burn because it basically means it's basically patch edge. So it could be to low severity or to moderate severity. And 300 meters and up, we don't even have anything to sample in that unburned high category. So we also ran some tests looking at it less than 200 meters, and we still found a very, very, very strong signal where the unburned high, or the once burned at high severity areas had much more regeneration than the twice burned at high severity areas. So it seems likely, although these weren't, one plot we were following through time, these are sort of space for time comparisons, it seems really likely that the removing that first cohort of conifers is going to have a real effect on the potential for reforestation. So we also were looking at surface fuels in terms of positive feedbacks, and that's just, to try and understand what the likelihood for continued reburning is. Because one of the things I think that's most interesting is that, sure, we know that historically we likely had patches of montane chaparral or non-forested areas within that bigger forest matrix, and a lot of those areas were physiographically maintained by severe fire. But in those cases, we rarely had an entire forest, an entire 100-year fire suppressed forest amount of fuel that had been killed in that first fire and it was put on the ground. So that we're basically, after that first fire, we kind of have a novel fuel type where we have shrub-dominated vegetation, but really, really heavy surface fuels. And so just to try and understand what was out there in terms of fine fuels, which, as you all know, I'm sure is considered more the driver of fire behavior, in that repeated high severity areas. Oh, I think this is a typo. This is a typo, I apologize. This should say, that first line, that first bullet, that areas that only burn once at high severity had fine fuels that were similar to what we call a slash model. And so those are usually the models used for post-logging or other major sort of unexpected disturbance events. And you can see over there on fine woody debris that it is much higher in that once burned at high severity there on the right, the UH. And however, for the repeated high severity, we've actually brought those fine fuels down into the range of shrub fuel models. For example, that shrub fuel model 7. 50% of those plots are still above that, since it's like sort of the mean, but we at least see that reduction after the second severe fire. For coarse woody debris, that's not quantified even for shrub communities. Generally, in terms of fuel models, we don't really quantify the coarse woody debris, but we also just in general aren't, there's not a lot of guidelines out there for it because this is sort of a novel fuel type. I will say though, I looked at the recommended ranges for forest debris, and that's for forested ecosystems from the Brown et al. Guidelines. And after that second severe fire, that repeated high severity, those sort of approach that recommended range. And however, for areas that were only once burned at high severity, that 1,000 hours is really exceeding that recommended range, which is, I think, about 11 to about 44 megagrams per hectare. And I think that the once burned at high severity was somewhere around 70, and that's the mean. So pretty heavy loads of coarse woody debris. So shifting to our second research question, where we looked at distinct states and what evidence there was for that. First, to look at richness. In these graphs, you'll see richness is on the y-axis, and for the top graph, the box plots split basically richness into native and non-native. In the bottom graph, they split between perennial versus annual biennial. And this is basically getting at all of the understory species, so all the herbs like forbs and grasses, but also does include the trees and shrubs. And so what we found is that repeated high severity areas did have lower overall richness, though the difference was not very large. We also found, in contrast to our expectation, lower non-native richness in that repeated high severity areas. There was no difference in annual richness, but it did have lower perennial richness, the repeated high severity areas, which may indicate a shift towards more annual dominance, even though there was no difference in the richness. In terms of our second sort of question about distinct states was that question about south temperate versus north temperate species. And To reiterate, it's just the idea of when you look at the evolutionary history of a given species, does it sort of come from a more south temperate climate area, or is it have more of a biogeographic affinity towards north temperate areas? And in this case, you can see the north temperate is in gray and the south temperate is in white. And richness is on the y-axis. And we found that there were fewer north temperate species in the repeated high severity areas. No difference though in the south temperate species. However, if you just looked at it proportionally, you see there's a much greater proportion of south temperate species in the repeated high severity areas, whereas the one spread at high severity is a little bit more evenly mixed. And so in terms of plant cover, you can see this, the total cover didn't really differ much. On the y-axis, there's total cover and its percent cover. It can exceed 100% because we did additive cover where we counted overlapping individuals, overlapping individuals, both counted basically. And so contrary to our expectation, although there wasn't a huge difference, the cover was higher in the once burned at high severity. And you can see much of that is dominated here, or much of that is driven by the shrub cover, which I think in part has something to do with the fact that many of our once burned at high severity sites had a little bit more white thorn, whereas the repeated high had more, I think, deer brush or Ceanothus indigramus. And literally their stature, it could be part of the difference there. We also see that there was higher forb cover in the once burned at high severity. But the trend, and the trend reverses though for graminoids. And you see much, much higher cover in the twice burned at high severity than the once burned at high severity. And most of that is driven by the non-native cheatgrass. And then looking down here at trees, we had very slightly higher tree cover in the repeated high severity areas, and that's driven pretty much all by oak species that could sprout. In terms of non-natives, as I mentioned, we had that really much, much higher non-native graminoid cover in the repeated high severity, and that's dominated really by cheatgrass, unfortunately. And there was also significantly lower non-native forb cover in that repeated high severity areas. So you can see this is a pretty big distinction. And a lot of that, I believe, was driven by Lactuca cereola. And so, you know, to get now to like the bigger picture and looking at community differences, we did a couple of tests where we looked at the entire plant community, and these are multivariate tests and also this visual ordination. And so what the Permanova test does, as well as the what we call NMDS ordination, is that for each plot you have that suite of cover data by species. And so those can be really difficult to compare with standard statistical tests. And so by using these multivariate analyses, you can sort of take that suite of information from each plot and just figure out how similar or different they are. And we found from the sort of the more statistical test, the Permanova, that there was a significant difference between the repeated high versus once burned at high severity communities. We then did this visual exploration of that data with an NMDS ordination. And you can see the red represent the once burned at high severity, and the black represent the twice burned at high severity. And there is, and the way that this works is it's plotting these plots in three-dimensional space based on their similarity or dissimilarity to each other. And so if you see a lot of separation, it means that they are very, very distinct. If you see them completely overlapping, it means there's not really any difference. And although it's not as separated as some of these ordinations can come out, there is a pretty clear distinction between those two communities. So something is definitely going on there. And that seems to be driven by life form cover shifts, where we get that dramatic increase, particularly of the grass cover or non-native grass cover in the repeated high severity areas. Finally, there was no difference in beta diversity. And again, that beta diversity is that idea that within a given fire history, the plots that are within that area would be more similar to each other. That's what we had expected, was that in repeated high severity areas, there'd be less diversity across the landscape. And so the plots that we had within that would be more similar to each other than the plots that were within the once burned at high severity. However, we found no difference in data diversity, so that hypothesis was not upheld. So our last test that we did to look at community differences was an indicator species analysis. And what this does is it basically looks at your data and tries to understand, or looks for species that have a high fidelity to one of the treatments, in this case fire histories, or the other, and how frequent it is in those areas. And so a species that's found on 50% of the plots in once burned at high severity, and a species found 50% in the plots that are twice burned at high severity, that's not going to come out as an indicator species because it could be found anywhere. This is sort of telling you that if you find these species, it's a high likelihood you're in one fire history area versus the other. And what I think is most interesting is that if you look at the unburned high, or the once burned at high severity, you can see that 2 conifers show up as indicator species, saying that they have such high fidelity to that area as opposed to the other. And that's white fir and ponderosa pine. In contrast, the repeated high severity areas didn't have any conifers, but had live oak. So that to me signals a real shift. The other thing I think to note is that Bromus tectorum, or cheatgrass, also came up as a indicator species for repeated high severity. And although we found that in the once burned at high severity areas, it was just so ubiquitous in the repeated high that it popped as a indicator species. Okay, so in conclusion, before I really give you a bunch of conclusions, I want to remind everybody that this is what we call a space for time substitution, meaning we didn't have the luxury of having plots that burned once at high severity, and then we followed those through time, knew how many regenerating conifers they had, and then had that plot reburn at high severity, so we could, and then watch that through time, so that we could really point exactly to what's happening on an individual site through time. Instead, we had to go find areas that had a fair history of twice burned at high severity versus once burned at high severity, but there are going to always be some site-specific differences that are going to confound our results a little bit. And that's just, there's really nothing that we can do about that. We didn't have the plots out there to do it otherwise. So it's imperfect. So I think everything that we found here, we want to try to go out and verify to the extent that we can. And I want to emphasize, I still think our conclusions and our findings are really informative. It's just you need to sort of keep it in context. And so what we found in terms really broadly is that repeated high severity doesn't have greater homogeneity. So that's that beta diversity. It's not, across the landscape, there's not less variation than there is in the once burned at high severity in terms of diversity and richness. But what we found is that repeated high severity does have a shift from the dominance from the seeding conifers to sprouters, and as well as annuals. We observed distinct plant communities between the 2 areas. There was lower richness in the repeated high severity, and we did indeed see higher richness of those south temperate species. I think one of the most interesting things to come out of the study, as I mentioned before, is the conifer regeneration, the reductions, the much lower densities that we saw after 2 high severity fires. And I think that really requires more study. There could be a few things going on there in terms of mechanisms of why that happened. One, we do have a couple Park Service plots in those areas, not enough to be able to say anything statistically, but we have these nice through time photographs. And so this picture was taken in the Ackerson fire a few, maybe 5-6 years before the Rim fire, and you can see really dense shrubs. And then this was taken 1 year after the Rim fire, and you can see already the shrubs are really sort of starting vigorously to sprout back. And by 4 years after, you're getting pretty dense shrub cover. And so one of the hypotheses is that potentially with so many shrubs established on site that can resprout so quickly, that maybe the competition is just too stiff in those early years where there is growing space, or where there normally after that first fire is a little bit more growing space for conifers to get established. Another idea that might be driving that is maybe that huge increase in cheatgrass, also in terms of changing competition. And then I think something that really warrants more study is how all of the heavy surface fuels that are on the ground after the first fire are potentially altering underground soil properties in such a way that make it more difficult for conifers to establish. We know that when those large heavy surface fuels burn and they sit on the ground and they will cook and burn for hours and days. And the soil heating can be very intense and can be lethal to microorganisms and fungi, etc. So somewhere in there, there's an answer, but we really need to do a little bit more work to figure out what's going on there. And so the way that I see it, overall, there is some support that severe fire is acting as a positive feedback in montane chaparral, and both that these communities may continue to support severe fire, and that also we're starting to see sort of a shift in potentially distinct plant communities in these areas, which may more so point towards the potential for type conversion than just seed limitation alone. So in terms of management implications, oh, whoops, number 3 is already jumping out. That was my punchline. So I think the first thing that's really important is to consider whether or not the area, when you're thinking about what to do afterwards, like what should we do with these large patches of high severity? And first, you need to really consider whether or not the area would have been forested prior to fire suppression, because there's a lot of areas, particularly say steep slopes, south-facing slopes, that are only supporting forest now after 100 years of fire suppression, where, you know, in that very long time scale, there are enough intervening years where weather and whatnot was favorable enough to allow for conifer establishment and no fires to take them out. And so some of these areas, and really these fires could be almost a restoration to a montane chaparral environment. But of course, we know there are very, very large areas burning that are probably more a product of the fuels after 100 years of fire suppression than just, you know, the physiographic, topographic position on the landscape. And so I think what we need to sort of say then is, okay, so if the site conditions are appropriate for forests and reforestation is desired, you have a few options. And the first is to exclude fire until seedlings have exceeded shrub height. That could be really difficult in the long run, and you will still have a significant surface fuel problem, so that when it does burn, you may get enough heat that you're getting mortality from scorch, even if the fire doesn't transition into the canopy. The next option is to plant trees, but of course that could require controlling competing vegetation and again, dealing with surface fuels. And that can, but if you know you want trees on that site, that is obviously going to be your fastest way to get there. But I think the final option, and I'd like to see us sort of consider more, especially since we know that we're going to be getting more and more of these large patches of high severity, are doing some cool season burns to reduce the surface fuels. In very large patch sizes, it's still going to be a really long march for regeneration, but you may at least reduce the potential for such severe fire in the future if you take care of some of those surface fuels on a time of year where, you know, it's not as hot and dry. And I know that many cool season burns, in terms of especially spring burns, can be really difficult to coordinate with wildlife managers who have concerns about ground nesting birds and etc. But this, when I say cool season, I just mean sort of shoulder season, off season. So it could be something that's late fall or winter. But I think that might be the way to take these communities that are really these novel fuel structures and reduce the fuel a little bit so that the next fires are a little bit more manageable. And with that, I just want to say thanks to my funding sources. I received a grant to do this work, the Graduate Student Innovation Award from Joint Fire Science. I also got some support from the National Park Service, as well as the Region 5 Ecology Program. And thanks for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kristen, for that. I want to mention too, so we'll go ahead and post this as a recording online, and with that page we'll have your contact information so people can email you if they have questions. Just look for that on our page. Thanks so much.